I want you all to know that today is the last time you will sit at this table. Elizabeth's voice broke the silence. The relatives looked around, unsure of what was being said. Elizabeth sat at the head of the table, holding a cup of tea but not touching it. Her gaze slid over the faces of her family: husband, mother, mother-in-law, sister, brother, their children and companions. Those who called themselves her loved ones were gathered in this room, but now, after all they had been through, they seemed alien, like foreign elements in her life that had poisoned her for years.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes. Dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
Do you know why I gathered you here today? Her voice sounded cold, and there was no hint of her usual softness or desire to please. The family looked at each other, unsure of how to answer. Elizabeth took a deep breath and, before continuing, remembered how her epiphany had begun. A few months ago, after years of endless fatigue, dizziness, and pain, Elizabeth was hospitalized with a suspected rare autoimmune disease. She was almost unable to get out of bed, her body refused to obey, and her mind was on the verge of despair. Lying in the hospital room, she was alone for the first time in a long time, without children, without a husband, without the worries of work and life. It was at that moment that the realization came to her. Years of living with the people around her had been nothing but a chain that tightened the noose around her throat. Elizabeth remembered staring at the ceiling of the ward for hours, realizing that her illness was probably the result of constant stress and fatigue. She had always tried to be good to everyone, a good wife to her husband, a perfect mother to her children, a faithful daughter and sister. But in this fast-paced race for approval, she had completely forgotten about herself. The realization came slowly, as if a mirror of illusion was shattering in front of her eyes, leaving her alone with reality. She couldn't go on living like this any longer. If I survive, she thought, I'll get rid of everyone who's dragging me down. And here she was at the table with a decision that had been brewing for many months. I want you all to know that today is the last time you sit at this table. Elizabeth's voice broke the silence. The relatives looked around, unsure of what the conversation was about. Let's start with you, Michael, Elizabeth said coldly, looking straight into the eyes of her husband, who had long since lost all the qualities that had once attracted her in her eyes. What? Michael asked confusedly, pitching forward. He wasn't used to that tone from Elizabeth. He had expected sympathy, the usual acquiescence, but instead he received a direct challenge. You've always been a weak man, Elizabeth began, and with each word her voice grew firmer. When we were married, I believed in you. I thought that in time you would become someone I could rely on, but you became just a shadow, an empty place in my home. You'd go out with your friends, drink, come back late, and when I tried to talk to you, you'd get angry or just shut up. You pretended like you didn't need me, and you know what? I realized it was true. You never loved me. You only took advantage of me, my patience, my efforts. But that's all changed now. Oh, has it? Michael burst out, leaning closer. You think I've given you nothing? What about the fact that I worked days on end so we could have a house? What about the fact that I provided for you and the kids? You provided for yourself, Michael, Elizabeth replied dryly. You were the one who bought yourself toys, cars, and entertainment. And me? I worked 2 jobs, took care of the kids and the house, while you did only what you wanted to do. That's nonsense, Michael exclaimed, pounding his fist on the table. You've always been ungrateful, and now it's become obvious. Ungrateful? Elizabeth couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. You have no idea what gratitude is, Michael. Because all our lives you've taken everything for granted. Well, today you've lost that. Go away and don't come back. Michael threw her an angry look, got up from the table, knocking over a chair, and silently walked out of the room, slamming the door. He wasn't used to losing, but this time he knew that arguing was futile. As the door slammed behind Michael, Elizabeth shifted her gaze to her mother-in-law, Helga, who had been silent the entire time, but her eyes were full of indignation. Now you, Elizabeth said coldly. What? Helga hissed, pressing her lips together. What do you want to tell me, girl? I have always been like a mother to you. Like a mother? Don't make me laugh, Helga, Elizabeth grinned. You have never accepted me. From day one you tried to put me in my place, to make me realize that I was nothing to you. You interfered in our marriage, humiliated me in front of Michael, and then pretended to be a caring mother-in-law. I just wanted you to become a decent woman. Helga began to justify herself. You were acting like a girl and someone should have explained that to you. No, Elizabeth objected sharply. You tried to destroy my self-esteem. Every time you said I couldn't cook, couldn't take care of the house, wasn't right for your son, that wasn't advice. It was a blow to my self-esteem. But you know what? Now I don't need your advice or your opinion. You will no longer poison my life. You ingrate! Shouted Helga, jumping up from her chair. You dare to speak to your husband's mother like that? I'm talking to the woman who ruined my life. And I will not allow it again. Go away. Helga didn't say another word. She stood for a few moments, then turned abruptly and left the house, slamming the door loudly. Elizabeth looked at her mother, Sophia, who was rubbing her hands together nervously, unsure of what to do. Mom, it's your turn, Elizabeth said softly but firmly. I know this will hurt you to hear, but it's time. Elizabeth, what are you doing? Her mother asked fearfully. I've always wished you only the best. You only wished me what you thought was right, Elizabeth replied, her voice growing colder. Ever since I was a child, you've insinuated that I wasn't good enough. You criticized me for everything, my looks, my choice of friends, my career. There was never a day when I felt good enough for you. I tried to please you, but all I got were more comments. I wanted you to be better. Sophia exclaimed. You were always weak and I tried to make you stronger. You made me weaker, Elizabeth said quietly but firmly. You've been undermining my confidence since I was a little girl, all to control me. But that's over now. I will no longer be your puppet. Elizabeth, please, Mother began, but Elizabeth shook her head. No, Mother. I love you, but I won't let you run my life anymore. Goodbye. Her mother stood up, confused and broken, and without another word, slowly walked out of the house. Elizabeth shifted her gaze to her sister Isabella, who sat across from her with a look of displeasure on her face. Isabella, the younger sister, was always the center of attention in the family. There was contempt in her eyes, as if she couldn't believe anyone dared to raise their voice at her. Isabella, Elizabeth began, taking a deep breath. You always thought you could treat me like a servant. I was anything to you, a nanny for your children, your personal driver, the person who solves your problems. Every time you had a problem, whether it was money, work, or even fights with your men, you called me. And you know what? I dropped everything to help you. Isabella rolled her eyes, her face beginning to flush with irritation. Elizabeth, stop this spectacle. You've always done this of your own free will. It's not like I forced you to. You never asked me if I needed it, Elizabeth replied sharply. You just got used to me always being there for you. You never thought about what I needed. Your life was always more important than mine. I was just a convenience to you. So what? It's called nursing. You're the oldest, so you took care of me. I didn't force you, by the way. You did, Isabella. But not with words, but with your actions, your manipulations, your pretenses, Elizabeth continued. You've always played on my sense of duty, on the fact that I'm the older sister. You're used to having the world revolve around you. But you know what? It doesn't anymore. I'm not your babysitter anymore. Isabella frowned, her voice hard. You're just jealous of me. Jealous that I'm doing better, that I have a family and a normal life. Elizabeth laughed, but there wasn't an ounce of joy in her laughter. A family? Your normal life is endless scandals with your husband and trying to shift your problems onto others. I don't want and won't get involved in your dramas anymore. You're a grown woman, Isabella. Deal with your problems on your own. You're so selfish, Isabella hissed. You just want to end our relationship because it's easier for you. Easier for me? Yes, Isabella. It's finally easier for me because I'm no longer carrying the weight of your problems. Goodbye. #family drama, Diana's story. Isabella jumped up, pushing her chair back loudly. Her eyes burned with rage, but she couldn't find the words to respond. Turning around, she flew out of the room, slamming the door loudly. As the door closed behind Isabella, Elizabeth turned to her brother Victor. He had always been aloof, rarely involved in family affairs, but he showed up every time he was in trouble. Now he sat shaking his leg and nervously rubbing his shirt sleeve. So, are you going to kick me out too? He asked ironically, without raising his eyes. Yes, Victor, Elizabeth said calmly. Because you were only in my life when you needed something. You always disappeared when I needed you. But as soon as you needed money, help with the kids, or just a place to wait out the hard times, you immediately remembered you had a sister. That's not true, Victor muttered, avoiding her gaze. I always tried to help whenever I could. Help? Elizabeth frowned. When? When I asked you to support me when my father died. Where were you then? When I was in the hospital, who visited me? Isabella? Andrei? Mom? What about you? You were busy with your business, your endless problems. All your help consisted only of your expectation that I'd lend you a shoulder again. Come on, you're just exaggerating, Elizabeth, Victor threw in irritably, tapping his fingers on the table. It wasn't all that bad. No, Victor, it was exactly like that. You were never there for me when I needed you. And I'm no longer going to be your big sister who always saves the day. You're on your own now. You'll never understand how hard it's been for me. Victor finally looked up at her. You live in your own world, but mine is more complicated than that. I have a family, a job, debts. And you think I don't have problems? Elizabeth interrupted him sharply. Everyone has their difficulties. But you never thought about just being a brother to me, not a beggar. All you ever wanted from me was gain. And I don't need that anymore. Victor stood up without saying a word. He pulled his keys out of his pocket, tossed them on the table and walked out, closing the door quietly behind him. Elizabeth watched him, feeling no more anger or pain. Now there were two others in the room, her cousin Sophie and her sister's husband Lucas. Sophie had always been cold and calculating, and her husband Lucas often hid behind her back, forever agreeing with everything his wife said. So what are you going to tell us? Sophie asked icily, crossing her arms over her chest. We kind of have nothing to do with this at all. Elizabeth clenched her hands into fists. Sophie, you've always been able to act like you're above everyone else. You thought I was jealous of you, didn't you? With all your success, with your money, with your perfect marriage. But you know what? I was never jealous of you. Because I've seen right through you. What are you talking about? Sophie frowned, her voice drenched in contempt. You always came to me when it was to your advantage. When you needed me to pick up your kids when you went on vacation, or help with your business, back you up on some business. And every time you acted like you were doing me a favor. You could have just said no. Sophie objected sharply. You never let me refuse because you knew how to manipulate me. You pretended to care, but really you were just using me. I won't be your puppet anymore. Lucas, who had been silent until then, suddenly intervened. Elizabeth, calm down. Sophie has always treated you with respect. Elizabeth turned a look full of contempt toward him. Lucas, you are nothing without her. You've always been her shadow. Even now you speak not your opinion but hers. You shouldn't be here at all. Both of you leave. Sophie snorted, stood up, and without another word left the room. As the door closed behind the last of the guests, the house fell silent. Elizabeth stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the remnants of her past. Chairs had been pushed back, cups unfinished, the table nearly empty. But now there was something new in that emptiness, freedom. She took a deep breath and felt a huge weight lifted off her shoulders. No one else would take advantage of her kindness, no one else would hold her captive to expectations and obligations. Elizabeth felt, for the first time in years, that she was living for herself. She walked through the house, slowly putting away dishes, moving chairs around. This house, which had once seemed like a prison, was now her sanctuary. With each movement, she felt herself filling with strength, cleansing herself of old, unnecessary burdens. Finally finished, she sat down on the couch, closed her eyes and felt a quiet but confident calm. This day was the beginning of her new life. Elizabeth sat in silence for a few minutes, absorbing this newfound freedom. Her heart, long constricted by oppressive relationships and responsibilities, beat smoothly, as if it had finally been freed from its invisible shackles. She felt, for the first time in a long time, that she had the right to live her life the way she wanted, not the way she had been forced to live it all these years. Her thoughts went back to the hospital, to those long days and nights when she realized that her illness was not just a physical problem, it was accumulated stress and dissatisfaction with life. Then, lying in the cold ward, she thought about how many years she had spent trying to please others. Trying to be good for everyone had not only ruined her health, it had robbed her of her personal freedom. But now she was ready to change that. Her illness had been a turning point, giving her the strength to break with the past, to free herself from those who used her. But how to move on? That question, once frightening to her, now seemed like a challenge she was ready to accept. Elizabeth looked around the room, a place that had once seemed to symbolize her failure and helplessness. Now this house, where she had endured other people's neglect for so many years, was a symbol of a new life for her. No longer would she be afraid of her decisions, no longer would she adjust to others. This is her home, her life, and she will start anew. It had been weeks since the day Elizabeth had sent all of her relatives out of her life. Each day spent alone gave her more and more strength. She began to notice that she was waking up with new thoughts and dreams rather than her usual sense of obligation to someone. She no longer waited for phone calls, no longer worried about other people's problems, no longer lived in constant tension. She took a new job not far from her home, so that she was no longer attached to past resentments and responsibilities. Now she worked in a small bakery. She had always dreamed of doing something warm and cozy. Every day, as she served fresh breads and rolls to her customers, she felt herself filling with life and happiness with every breath. Her body began to change too, her strength was returning and her health was improving. Elizabeth often thought back to those days in the hospital when she thought all was lost, but now she knew that life was just beginning. One day, a few months after her decisive goodbye, Elizabeth sat on the porch of her house, sipping tea and enjoying the cool evening. It was a quiet day. She had planned to spend the evening with a book. But suddenly the doorbell rang. She opened it and saw her mother, Anna, on the doorstep. Elizabeth frowned, not knowing what to expect from this visit. "Mom?" she said incredulously, taking a step back, letting her know she wasn't ready to invite her inside. Sophia stood with her hands clasped across her chest, her face tense, but this time there was no reproach or anger in her eyes. "Elizabeth," she began, her voice trembling. "Can I come in?" Elizabeth pondered for a few moments but then nodded. Her mother entered the house, looking around as if everything here was a stranger. They sat down at the kitchen table, where it had all started months ago. "Why did you come?" Elizabeth asked quietly, holding back a flood of memories of the day she had seemed to sever all ties with this man. "I wanted to talk," Sophia replied, lowering her eyes. "About what happened. About us." Elizabeth didn't know what to say. It wasn't easy for her to hear her mother's voice again, especially after everything she'd said then. But deep down she knew this meeting was inevitable. "I realized a lot of things after you kicked us all out," her mother continued, her voice quiet and sad. "You were right. I demanded too much of you. I saw you as a reflection of my own failures and it made me angry. I tried to make you strong, but I only destroyed you. And I apologize." Those words stunned Elizabeth. She had never expected an apology from her mother, a person who had always been a source of criticism and rebuke to her. For years she had longed to hear something like this, but now that it had happened, she felt a mixture of relief and pain. "I don't know if it can be undone," Sophia continued, looking at her daughter. "But I want to at least try. I want to be the mother to you that I wasn't before." Elizabeth looked at her mother, trying to find the words within herself. Part of her wanted to reject the offer, afraid of being trapped in old resentments and expectations again. But the other part knew that everyone deserved a second chance. Even the one who hurt you the deepest. "Mom," she said quietly, taking a breath, "I can't forgive you right away. I need time. I've been thinking a lot about our past, about how you affected me. But if you're willing to work on it, maybe we can start from scratch." Sophia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm ready, Elizabeth. I really want this." They sat in silence, and that silence was no longer filled with anger or disappointment. It was the silence of hope, a small but important step toward reconciliation. After that day, their relationship wasn't immediately perfect. They slowly and carefully began to build it anew. Sophia no longer pressured Elizabeth, learning to see her as an independent and strong woman. Elizabeth, in turn, began to forgive, though it was not easy. Periodically, other relatives came to see her, Isabella, Victor. Some of them tried to justify themselves, others asked for forgiveness. But Elizabeth was in no hurry to bring them back into her life. She needed time to learn to live for herself before she would open her doors again to any of those who had once betrayed her. But now her life was all about herself. And that became the most important decision she made. Elizabeth began a new chapter of her life, a life where she no longer owed anyone. She learned to appreciate silence, to honor her desires, and to put her needs first. And every day she woke up in her home, she knew that things would be different now. This was not the end of her story, but only the beginning of her new life, where she was the mistress of her destiny. It had been months since Elizabeth had broken all her old ties, gaining her long-awaited freedom. But there was one exception in her life that she often thought about but never dared to speak of: her eldest daughter, Emma. Emma was 24 years old, and their relationship had always been complicated. Since their teenage years, they had rarely found common ground. Emma had always thought her mother was weak, too submissive and subservient to the family's opinions. She had left to study in another city, and since then had only spoken to her mother out of necessity, reproaching her for her weakness and dependence on others. But now everything had changed. Elizabeth knew it was time to explain herself to her daughter, to tell her how she had changed and why she had acted the way she had. She thought long and hard about how to begin this conversation, for Emma could be more harsh than any of her relatives. One quiet evening, Elizabeth, gathering her courage, decided to call Emma. Long beeps, then a short answer. "Hello, Mom?" came her daughter's voice, cold and detached. "Hi, Emma," Elizabeth began, clutching the receiver nervously. "I need to talk to you. Could you come over?" Emma faltered. Her voice was strained. "What is there to talk about? I mean, you chose your path a long time ago, and I understand you feel good there." "Yes, you're right. I have chosen. But I'd like you to know why. And so we could talk about you and me." Elizabeth spoke carefully, trying not to let her emotions come to the surface. After a long pause, Emma replied, "Okay. I'll come over this weekend." The weekend came sooner than Elizabeth expected. As Emma crossed the threshold of the house, tension hung in the air. She looked older than her years, reserved and serious, her long dark hair tied back in a severe ponytail, and her eyes looked wary. Elizabeth invited her daughter to sit in the kitchen, at the same table where she had recently sent the entire family out of her life. Emma looked around the interior carefully, noticing the changes. She sensed that something had happened, but she wasn't sure what. "So, what did you want to tell me, Mom?" Emma got straight to the point, without further preamble. Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling old fears boiling up inside. But she knew she couldn't let them take over. "I wanted to tell you what happened. I broke things off with everyone." Emma raised an eyebrow, her eyes sparkling with surprise. "With everyone? Are you serious? And you're still calling me after that?" "Yes, with everyone," Elizabeth confirmed. "I was tired of being who everyone saw me as. I was convenient for anyone who wanted to take advantage of my kindness. And the disease helped me realize that. I can no longer live the way I used to." Emma was silent, but her face expressed a mixture of surprise and bewilderment. "So now what? You want me to drop everything too and start living like you?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No, Emma. I'm not asking you to do anything. I just want you to understand me, so that we can rebuild what we've lost." Emma frowned, her voice becoming harsher. "And what do you want? Recognition that you're finally back on your feet? I always thought you put up with too much, did too much for others. But I didn't think you'd change so much." "I'm not asking for your confession," Elizabeth replied calmly. "I just want you to realize that I've changed for myself, not for others." Emma leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "So now what? I have to start being a daughter to you again? We've barely spoken to each other all this time. You yourself created the distance I've accepted." Those words cut Elizabeth like a knife. It pained her to hear that her daughter felt so detached, but she knew there was truth in those words. "Yes, I know. It's my own fault for not paying attention to our relationship. I was consumed with other problems. But things are different now, Emma. I want us to try to rebuild what we've lost." Emma frowned. "You think it's that easy? You think one conversation is enough to make things right?" "No, I don't think so," Elizabeth replied, looking into her daughter's eyes. "I know it will take time. But I'm willing to try. And if you're not ready, I'll accept it. But I don't want to lose you." Emma was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "You've already lost me, Mom. I've been living my life for a long time. And to be honest, I'm not sure I want to go back to the way things were." Elizabeth felt something inside her clench, but she knew she had no right to rebuke. Her daughter was right, she had let her go on her own years ago, and now the return would not be quick. "I understand, Emma. I don't want to force you," she replied. "But if you ever want to come back, I'll always be there for you. This time for you, not for others." Emma looked at her intently, as if trying to see how sincere her words were. Something resembling softening flashed in her daughter's eyes, but she quickly looked away. "I'll think about it, Mom," she said dryly, standing up. "But I promise nothing." Elizabeth nodded, realizing that was enough. It was a small step toward repairing their relationship, but a step they were both willing to take. When the door closed behind Emma, Elizabeth was alone in the empty house. She knew there were more challenges ahead, but she also knew that she had done everything she could. And now, finally, she had hope for the future she was building for herself and her daughter, one step at a time.